Hello everybody and welcome to the movies I watched this month. It's officially spooky season, so I did watch quite a few horrors in this one. I also spread them out with a few old and modern releases in between. So without any further ado, and keeping in mind that this video is pretty spoiler free, here's what I watched in October 2023. I think that old joke of this film is Fight Club but for women is a little played out these days, but my god, if Bottoms doesn't fit that bill, then I don't know what does. And no, that's not because it actually contains a fight club, but because the premise of the movie isn't the actual point, but instead the source for the real themes to flow from. Neither films are really about violence, they tackle toxic masculinity and how it affects the world, only this movie has far more fun with itself. I like that it didn't take itself seriously. There are countless things floating around in the background that never get addressed, but seem to point out how things here are a little weird. There's a random student locked in a cage for the whole movie. We later learn he's the school wrestling champion. And the football team are always in their uniform for some reason. Everyone in this film is solely associated with the clique or the group that they belong to, and it doesn't want you to forget that. It's a pretty difficult task to explore subjects like feminism while poking fun at masculinity, without it coming across as mean-spirited or just childish. But clearly 2023 is the year, because Barbie did it and now Bottoms has done it as well. The whole cast of characters here are simply likable, so even when they have their predictable blowout, you want to see them overcome their issues and get back together again. Everything from the Avril Lavigne needle drop to the wonderfully campy and surprisingly violent finale just wrapped me up in a warm, melodramatic blanket and made me feel safe. It's funny, it's quirky, and well worth your time. Check it out. Hitchcock, baby! The big man likes to tackle each of his movies with different themes and analogies for added depth, and I think what Vertigo explores through its runtime is the idea of psychological obsession. What initially begins as a rather straightforward romance story soon evolves into a messy trail of lies, deceit, and authority. We're forced to watch as a once blossoming couple are left reeling due to his lust and need for control, and her pain and sorrow over everything she's done. They're both being torn apart because of the actions of a third party who's not even there. In fact, the film even begins to parallel Hitchcock's own relationship with women in parts. He's been known to treat them rather harshly in the name of perfecting his ideal image for them, which is exactly what Scotty does to Judy. It does begin to feel a little odd with the age difference between the two though. While not impossible, I found it hard to buy into then 25-year-old Kim Novak being so entranced with a 50-year-old Jimmy Stewart. However, Vertigo is still impressive from a technical standpoint, with two of my favourite shots from the director coming here. The one, and likely his most famous, is the tracking dolly zoom down the stairwell to give the audience a taste of what the condition feels like. The other is the more subtle yet equally as effective scene where the camera circles around the two leads as they embrace, and the background fades away into darkness. Yes, the film is very good, but no, it's not one of the best films of all time, at least in my opinion. I respect it, and I enjoyed it, but that ending does leave a lot to be desired. There aren't many remakes of classic horror movies that manage to improve on the source material, yet I dare say that Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead is one of them. It does away with the campy nature of the series' second and third installments, and aims to re-envision the 1981 original through the modern lens of the post-torture porn era of cinema. It does unfortunately have to carry over some of that film's weaknesses though, like how the characters act in unrealistically stupid ways to progress the plot, but it manages to overcome this for the most part by adding far more depth to them as people. None of the survivors or victims in this feel like cardboard cutouts in the way they did in the original. They all have their own goals, desires, and weaknesses. The choice to have Jane's Levy character be an addict in remission was a brilliant one, because it not only adds more layers to her backstory, but increases the tension between her and the group. It becomes difficult to tell what is a symptom of deadite possession versus the side effects of quitting cocaine cold turkey. I think this movie is great. For more thoughts, check out my Evil Dead ranking that I uploaded not too long ago. So after countless sequels and 2 attempts to reboot the series, the Saw franchise finally feels like it found its footing. Instead of focusing primarily on gross out gore effects, don't worry though, there's still plenty here, Saw X decides to build its story around the man himself. Being set between the first and second installments, the film manages to bypass the pressing issue of the series' main character being dead, and crafts an experience that actually has a compelling story. Despite the other movies going completely bonkers with the violence, what always made me tune in was how they constantly revealed more about Jigsaw's past, and were able to pull a captivating twist out of nowhere. It was fun to see what they'd come up with next. This one, though, actually has a main narrative focus that goes beyond bad people in torture games. The first half hour or so of this felt like a completely different movie and very out of place in the Saw franchise, in a good way. Dare I say, the story actually has an emotional center and makes the victims such antagonistically unlikable people that you end up rooting for John. Not in a Carnage Candy way, but the film itself frames him as an anti-hero. I'm not really sure how I feel about this, because as always, Jigsaw's logic is super flawed, but then again, Tobin Bell is so good in this that I was glad to be firmly on his side. There were a few small things that didn't sit with me, like John's omnipotence being super important for how things play out the way they do. He's always kind of been this way, but he somehow knows everything that can and will happen before it eventually does, and always has the last laugh, even when the odds of things panning out that way are just super slim. Overall, I'd say that the care and detail put into Saw X pays off, because it actually feels like a movie, instead of the 10th entry in a yearly Halloween, low-budget gore fest. It does drag a little in the middle, but it was interesting to see Jigsaw challenge the morals of people in a way where it actually feels like the punishment fits the crime. The middle chapter of Kieślowski's trilogy, White, represents equality and tells a story of how far a man will go to reclaim it. Karol is a Polish immigrant who's found himself down on his luck in Paris. He's been divorced from his wife for not being able to put out, and his bank account has been frozen, leaving him broke and homeless. He appears on the verge of giving in completely until he meets Mikołaj, who presents him with an opportunity to reclaim what he once lost. It's a little difficult to compare this to Blue, because despite being a part of the same trilogy, they're so different in style. I actually think I prefer the story of this one. It unfolds in more interesting ways and has a premise that is a little more empathetic to me. That being said, I can't help but feel that the distinctive filmmaking present in the previous film is absent here. Maybe it was intentional, with white being the colour of focus here, but the way this was structured, shot, and edited together was a little plain in comparison. It hardly takes away from the film, but knowing what Kieślowski is capable of doing with a story this personal makes it a little disappointing to see it structured like any old movie. It has a slightly more comedic tone than the first film, but White is still a little bleak in its depiction of equality. Karol feels that he's treated unfairly in the beginning for not being able to speak French, and the only way he's able to reclaim that sense of respect isn't actually through equality, but rather dominance. He builds his way up through economics and cheating his way to where he needs to be. Who knows, maybe it's realistic, or perhaps this is the only way a narrow-minded individual could think of pulling a feat like this off. Who's to say, really? So, apparently the studio recognized that the main issue with Friday the 13th was its reliance on repeating the same formula year after year, so they went and gave the final girl superpowers. Tina works fairly well as a troubled young protagonist, and her telekinesis gives us something new to engage with. I think this film is peak Jason. This is his best look by far, from the general build and choice of clothes to the makeup and prosthetics, like the exposed spine on the back. It's also Kane Hodder's debut in the role, who for my money is the best actor to take on the character. No one else put anywhere near the time and effort into the role, and it definitely pays off. The man takes a beating in this, and it makes for a super entertaining time. That being said, it does take a while to get there, with Jason mostly being cut around in the edit for the first 2 acts. The opening hour consists of either shallow characters talking about uninteresting things, or heavily censored kills with nothing much to take in. The only one that stands out is the sleeping bag kill. All the others are underwhelming in the creativity department and in what we're actually able to see. So, it's not great, and doesn't have any intention of propelling the series to new heights, but at least it's not boring, which a good few of these films are. Gareth Edwards' new film, The Creator, tries really hard to blend thrills and excitement with intellectualism, but actually kind of nosedives in doing so. To its credit, the film looks great and manages to appear similar in scale to James Cameron's latest outputs, despite its $80 million budget. However, in attempting to juggle its priorities, it results in something too generic to be exciting, and too shallow to make you think. Despite some great CGI, the whole world of this movie feels very by the numbers for sci-fi. It borrows a lot from other older and, let's be honest, better projects by building its foundation off of what feels like Avatar mixed with Blade Runner. On top of that, Alfie is just another chosen one type of character that the initially reluctant father figure has to guide to a safe haven. She is Ellie from The Last of Us. She is John Connor from The Terminator. She is Grogu from The Mandalorian. My point being, nothing here is interesting or original. I also think the screenplay is super poorly written from multiple aspects. Not only was the father-daughter bond super forced and not developed well at all, but there were so many instances of the writers writing themselves into a corner. For example, they need Joshua to escape at one point, but he also has to know where Alfie is, so a series of completely unlikely events happen to make sure these conditions are met. Characters have to do stupid things even though none of these people would actually make these choices. The film seems to portray the machines as in the right, with people being the true monsters, but it felt a little awkward to me, especially in the current climate with the recent writer's strike, to say, you know, maybe AI should take some of our jobs away. So many movies have tried to tackle these issues or ideas, but actually then do something interesting with them or present an engaging discussion to be had. The creator seems to tread water, coasting by, hoping that no one will notice how truly devoid of substance it is. By this point, it's painfully apparent that this series is running out of steam. I know that this is the joke of the movie, but for a film called Jason Takes Manhattan, we don't even get to see Manhattan until over an hour into the film, with the first 60 minutes or so taking place on a cruise ship. Aside from the misleading marketing, we have some of the worst characters in the series so far. Genuinely, I don't remember any character's name in this one except for Julius because of how little impression they leave. On top of that, we enter a weirdly dark tone for Friday the 13th, with a bunch of junkies attempting to sexually assault someone. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea, unless it was to get us to want Jason to kill somebody. Oh, and then you've got the constant apparitions of Kid Jason that don't make any sense. I don't know why they're there, what purpose they serve, and why they look so bad, but they certainly do. I can at least give props to how cool it is to see the big man in Times Square, and Kane Hodder still gives a good performance as the character. His version of Jason always comes across as super pissed off, and I kind of like that about him. He literally punches a kid's head off his shoulders in this, which made me laugh, so good job, movie, I guess. Celine Song's debut movie, Past Lives, is a story about how relationships affect us. From forgettable brushes with strangers at the train station to long-term life partners, everyone we meet and interact with leaves a form of impression on us, for better or for worse. The idea of Inyeon at first appears to be a nice little Korean folklore kind of thing, but soon clearly becomes the whole point of this tale. Nora and Haesung are separated as children when Nora's family decides to emigrate to Canada, which kickstarts the entire series of events that take place here. Song does a good job of directing the thing from the beginning, with the children's paths home forking in two different directions, foreshadowing their inevitable separation. Nora lives further up the hill, literally and metaphorically taking the higher path where she can focus on her career and becoming a writer. Haesung, meanwhile, is forced to take the lower path, following the status quo and never really pushing himself in the same way, because he never got over his best friend leaving. That's what I found interesting about this film. Everything that isn't said is equally as important as things that are explicitly stated through speech. And when the two meet up again in 12 years' time, they both yearn for each other's company, but aren't willing to come outright and say it. Instead, their relationship is developed entirely through subtext. It's clever, it's happy, it's sad, it's thought-provoking, and definitely worth a watch. Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street is arguably the most important slasher film to come out of the 80s, which is funny when you think about it because despite Robert Englund's wonderfully iconic performance as Fred Krueger, he really isn't in this that much. Less than 7 minutes of screen time is dedicated to the main antagonist of the film, but somehow it works because most of the atmosphere is derived from the sets and locations. It does an incredible job of blending dreams and reality in such a way that it becomes hard to differentiate the two. From smoky alleyways to the dead silent school halls, you begin to fall down the rabbit hole with the characters and have trouble identifying what's real and what is a construction. Craven wrote some actually engaging and well-rounded characters to accompany the story, which is a refreshing change, especially after making your way through the Friday the 13th series. The practical effects in here are all pretty solid, from Freddy's body horror stuff to the sequence with Tina being dragged onto the ceiling, to Nancy's bedroom wall flexing in the night. It's all good stuff, which adds a sense of authenticity to proceedings where other films of this ilk try to disguise their low budget. Yes, some of the characters' choices are a little dumb, and the last minute of the film comes so bizarrely out of left field that it leaves you scratching your head through the credits, but for most of its runtime, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a great time. It balances genuine scares with cheesy 80s camp in the best way, and deserves its status as one of the genre's most popular entries. You know, I think despite its quirks and fever-dreamy nature, this is David Lynch's most accessible movie. That's not to say, however, that it's any less visceral in how it depicts or explores its themes. The film is about American suburbia and how the imagery of an idyllic neighborhood is seemingly prioritized over the actual maintenance of one. I think that people tend to paint a lot of Lynch's work with the same brush and complain how it's always about the dark things that go on behind the scenes, and while that is often true, there's usually more than meets the eye with his individual stories. Blue Velvet isn't specifically about the dark underbelly of suburban life, but rather how an innocent boy reacts to discovering it. Jeffrey finds himself at odds with his own feelings on the subject. After learning of a local crime ring, a potential kidnapping, body mutilation, and sex slavery, he's simultaneously disgusted and intrigued. He wants to go to the police with what he's learned, but knows that if he does, his own investigation will end and he'll no longer have a part in this story. On top of that, his relationship with Dorothy has him torn between his two lives. The old life where he lives with his aunts and is courting a nice girl, and this new exciting but equally dangerous pursuit of justice. David Lynch seems to make movies as therapy, and in doing so cleanses his soul while simultaneously taking us on that same thought-provoking but gratifying journey. I really like this movie. I'm so glad I don't have to watch this rancid series anymore. Which is funny, because it started off as campy fun that you could enjoy for its naffness, but it soon devolved into something that just makes me sad. Despite the CGI improving and the story being more focused, I still can't believe that the final chapter is a movie that someone actually died to make. Seriously, a crew member was fatally crushed by a prop, and a stunt woman was put into a 2-week coma, and then needed her arm amputated. For this. The ending of the previous movie set up certain plot points that once again aren't explored in the follow-up, things are retconned, characters are recast, and the finale is so rushed that when it ends you can't help but think, is that it? 6 films worth of build-up for that? Ian Glenn is clearly having fun and hamming up his performance as he probably should, but then you have Wesker, who's been a thorn in Alice's side for like 4 movies, who is immediately dispatched in like 10 seconds at the end. It's even difficult to appreciate the action sequences for what they are, since 70% of the shots here are way too dark, and the average shot length seems to be about half a second. There are just under 6,000 cuts in this movie. You can't tell what's going on half the time, or who is where doing what. It might just be the worst edited film I've ever seen. Fair play, Doobie White, you fucked it. It's funny, if you knew nothing about this, then the title and poster would have you believe that it's another Narnia type of story, but Bridge to Terabithia is something wholly different. It's not actually about magic kingdoms or creatures, it's about friendship. Jess has no real friends, he's bullied at school and doesn't fit in with his family, but when he meets Leslie, he feels like he belongs to something. Of course though, anybody who knows anything about the film knows that it scarred the minds of many unsuspecting children when it came out. There's a certain tragedy that happens to kick off the final act, and I think that it does a pretty good job of introducing kids to the concept of death and how it affects people surrounded by it. We never dwell on the specific details of the events, and instead explore the guilt, regret, and sorrow that the other characters feel because of it. It does fall victim to having a few cliches and two-dimensional characters here and there, like the school bullies who are so cartoonishly mean and ruthless that they wouldn't seem out of place in a Stephen King story. I also think that the character of Maybelle is quite underwritten, causing her to come across as annoying more than innocent. It's not the greatest thing ever, but for what it is, I kind of enjoy it. Sure, Spiral has its flaws, but hell if people didn't half over-hate on this thing. I know it's not a masterpiece or anything, but die-hard Saw fans will tell you that this is the worst one, and it most certainly is not. If nothing else, the switch to a police procedural setting is a nice change for the franchise that gets to stick to its roots without having to try and make people's suffering entertaining again. I do, however, think that the premise was wasted a little in areas, and the theme of police corruption wasn't explored as deeply as it probably should have been. It didn't pose any moral dilemmas or attempt to have the corrupt officers justify themselves. It was just that cliche of, we did awful things to keep the streets safe. At one point, someone even says Jigsaw doesn't target cops, and I had to take a moment of silence for David Tapp, Stephen Singh, Eric Matthews, Alison Kerry, Daniel Rigg, and Mark Hoffman. And those are just Kramer's victims. On the positive side, I think that after like a decade of putting up with Jigsaw's ridiculous logic and moral code, the killer's motives in this actually make sense and is set up reasonably well for you to work out, instead of relying on a last-minute twist to reveal information we didn't have before. And believe it or not, I didn't hate Chris Rock in this. I thought he was fine, considering this is the first dramatic role I've seen him take, and he also did his best with the sometimes jarring switch in tone. The song in the credits was whack though. Perhaps one of 2023's more polarizing releases, No One Will Save You has plenty going for and against it throughout its runtime. It's rather obviously influenced by its contemporaries and seems to plod along as a mashup of A Quiet Place and Signs without displaying the endearing spirit of either. Once again, though, the contrarian in me rears its head, because the general consensus seems to be that this movie starts off strong and loses itself along the way, but I strongly disagree. I actually think that the first 2 acts of this film are severely underwritten and don't have enough meat on their bones to really justify their existence. While the initial invasion was shot and edited rather well, the cat and mouse chase scenes through the house quickly outstayed their welcome and caused the film to drag for a good while. On the flip side, the final 30 minutes actually worked far better for me. This is the point where the movie seems to realize that something needs to happen now, so not only do the aliens do something different besides chasing Bryn through the house, but we get far more context in regard to the character's backstory and motivations. The filmmaking in that last act is more effective because of the dreamy, surreal nature of those circumstances, and the whole gimmick of having no dialogue works far better here, both in how it works stylistically and how plausible it would be where the first half of the movie came across as a little forced in the fact that nobody ever spoke. It was okay, but not something I have any real desire to watch again. Just to stomp out any sense of doubt, Wes Anderson proves that his immediately recognizable and distinct style of filmmaking does translate to animation. Despite completely switching the medium that he has to work in, Fantastic Mr. Fox still maintains all of the director's signature moves, from the delivery of deadpan humor to the symmetrical shots and whip pans used to establish the scenes. Somehow he managed to keep all of his flair and style without losing anything in the process, which is pretty incredible. The movie is oozing with charm thanks to the stop motion, and the textures used, from smoke particles to the fox's fur, give the film a real tangible sense of character and identity. I've never seen anything that looks or feels like this. Watching the narrative unfold is almost like reading through a pop-up book, where certain key items and characters leap off the page to grab your attention, which is actually pretty unique for the medium. Unfortunately, there was a slight emotional disconnect I had to the characters because they were either too underdeveloped or brought any problems they faced onto themselves. I didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for Mr. Fox or Ash because of how they behave, and characters like Christopherson and Kylie were a little one note for me to care about. It's difficult to explain, but for a movie with a lot of heart, it didn't pull at mine very much. However, I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with it and is 100% worth watching just for the incredible animation alone. I'm still yet to see Isle of Dogs, but if it's half as good as this, then I know I'm in for a good time. Get Out was the first film of the 2010s that I knew for certain would be a future classic. And how could it not? The writing is so fresh and sharp that there's nothing else like it, and the performances from the whole cast are absolutely fantastic. Daniel Kaluuya specifically is incredible here. He's able to communicate every second of awkward and uneasy feelings without a single line of dialogue. Yet on top of that, you always get that sense that he's not all that surprised by it. From the scene early on with the cop to actually meeting Rose's family and their friends, the casual racism that Chris experiences is just another day for him, and that's what cements the film's entire message. This isn't a horror in the traditional sense. It's not filled with jump scares or reliant on stalking villains to ramp up the tension. It instead focuses on the unfortunately very real perception and treatment of black people. Everything from one man saying black is in fashion to the whole party dropping silence when Chris goes upstairs just adds more and more to that tense and uncomfortable atmosphere. The feeling of not belonging is entirely what drives the film, and even if not from a racial standpoint, I think we can all relate to that in one way or another. I've always loved Get Out, but this most recent rewatch fully cemented it as one of my all-time favourites. There's always something else to pick up on in a future viewing, and it never seems to lose any of its bite or punch. Check it out, it's pretty great. The Truman Show is a story about spectacle and how society tends to prioritize that over seemingly everything else. The film is about Truman Burbank, who comes to realize that his entire life is being recorded 24/7 and is a part of a very popular reality TV show that millions of viewers watch every day. This came out in 1998 and was quite apt for the time, with television ratings at an all-time high, but the central premise of the film has only gotten better with age. We used to rely on talented people to create content for us, be it music, film, novels, etc., but today we've turned the people themselves into the content. Reality television and platforms like YouTube have made all these celebrities out of nothing, and is why we get shows where people parade their private lives and children around as if they've done something worth being proud of. And people actually consume it. Technology is incredible and capable of so many great things, but it's also allowed us to turn living, breathing people into consumable products that we'll cast aside as soon as the content stops. It's really sad, because despite the seemingly upbeat tone of the ending, I think it's quite pessimistic in its view on people, even if probably correct. This is overall a super smart script with a satisfying ending to boot. However, I can't help but feel that the premise would have been explored more deeply if handled by another writer. I think Andrew Niccol did a good job, but maybe someone like Charlie Kaufman would have handled it in a more surreal and bleak way. I still enjoyed it a lot though, and would recommend it to anyone who hasn't seen it and likes a little existential dread now and then. Chris Morris's Four Lions is a movie so outrageous in subject matter and so obviously guaranteed to offend people that I'm amazed it was ever greenlit. It's a story of a group of young Muslims who want to become martyrs for the jihad and plan to blow up something in the name of doing something radical with a smile on their face. I barely ever audibly laugh out loud when watching films, but I watched this with two friends and a father of a friend, and we were belly chuckling the whole way through. Working as a political satire, Four Lions also teeters into becoming a drama at times. In their attempt to plan a terrorist attack, it becomes obvious that they seem to care more about how they enter the next life than they do how they spend the one they're currently living in. It gets quite real in places, and the ending is weirdly emotional for what the film has been up to that point. You wouldn't think that you care about these people who are, let's be honest, the villains of the story, but you genuinely do. Definitely not the most PC film in recent years, but it's so funny and quotable to me that it's super easy to recommend. This movie isn't all that good. The inventiveness and psychological horror from John Carpenter's original movie has faded away to make room for the superhuman, stalking slasher villain that you come to expect from this series' ripoffs like Friday the 13th. Even the creative kills from Halloween 2 aren't here anymore, which makes for a disappointingly tame horror flick. I don't really understand how Michael is alive or why he suddenly wakes up in this after 10 years of being comatose, but once he does, he doesn't wait long to get back to his usual routine. Since his iconic mask was destroyed in Halloween 2, he picks up a new one here, and oh boy does it look bad. The mask is awful, and the weird sort of padded shoulders look borderline hilarious, and the general portrayal of Myers by George P. Wilbur isn't much to write home about either. However, Donald Pleasance is hamming up his role from the first two movies and playing it camp enough for it to be a little entertaining. His verging on insane ramblings continue to up the stakes and make for a pretty enjoyable time when he's on screen. I also think that Rachel is a pretty competent final girl for a Halloween movie without Laurie Strode, and Danielle Harris is incredible as Jamie, making for one of horror's most engaging and impressive child actors. It's not the worst in the series, but unless you're trying to work your way through the series, there isn't much reason to watch this specific Halloween film. Passages tells the story of Thomas, a young man living in Paris whose relationship with his husband begins to strain after he has an affair with a woman. The film follows the aftermath of all this and depicts how this momentary decision would go on to affect the rest of his life through his bitterness, his jealousy, and his narcissism. Thomas is a film director, an auteur who micromanages his actors and even the extras. He insists that one of them isn't walking down the stairs correctly. He gets frustrated when one woman is holding an empty glass. He's very clearly used to having things his way and doesn't like situations that fall out of his control, which is very poetic for the events to come. After a short amount of time watching him balance the life he once had with his husband and his newfound infatuation with Agathe, it becomes clear that he's developed a habit of using people to make himself happy. He wants to have it both ways, so when he gets bored of one, he just slithers away to the other. Any other film would have the husband and the new love interest at each other's throats, but Passages takes a completely different approach. The two actually embrace the love triangle, albeit in a slightly uncomfortable way, and clearly have more respect for each other than Thomas does for either one of them. It's somewhat nihilistic in the sense that Thomas continues to make terrible decisions and never seems to learn his lesson, but also somewhat hopeful in that even if he doesn't change, he at least gets to suffer the appropriate consequences. The irony isn't lost on me that this is a 2020 film following a character self-isolating at home from a deadly virus that is plaguing the world. #Alive follows Oh Jun-woo as the zombie apocalypse kicks off, and he decides to stay in his apartment and keep himself entertained until he's rescued. But what began with a really unique and interesting premise soon devolved into a very typical zombie movie affair. I thought the basic idea was a creative new way of exploring a very oversaturated genre, but by the 45-minute mark, the premise was seemingly scrapped to make way for the usual tropes associated with these kinds of movies. Now, the physicality of the stunt performers in these Korean zombie movies always seemed to impress me, something I first noticed with Train to Busan, and obviously holds true here as well. They give so much of themselves into their performances and lend a real sense of viscerality to the experience. Unfortunately though, despite having a great pair of actors in the leads, the characters aren't developed all that well for a movie that begins with an isolated protagonist stuck at home. Oh Jun-woo has to carry the first half hour of the film on his own, and while we can sympathise with his predicament, we still don't learn an awful lot about him. We know he's a gaming live streamer and that he doesn't buy enough food. That's about it. #Alive is an entertaining movie for its relatively tight runtime, but I do feel that its lack of creativity in the execution of certain elements make for just another mediocre, straight-to-Netflix horror movie. Fair play to Mr. Scorsese, he's still very much at the top of his game. Killers of the Flower Moon tells the story of the Osage clan who discover oil on their land, which leads to them becoming exceedingly rich, which then escalates when people start dying in suspicious circumstances. Early on in the film, Ernest flicks through a book and reads the words, "Do you see the wolves in this picture?" This is everything that the film will be about for the next 3.5 hours. The whole plot centers around the way that evil operates in plain sight. There's never really an effort to keep any of it hidden, it's all out in the open, yet it goes ignored. This mostly comes down to the actions of William Hale, for my money Robert De Niro's most evil character, who is a narcissistic sociopath and manages to slip under the radar despite arranging the murders of countless people with a fairly obvious motivation. He plays political mind games and never gets his hands dirty, which allows him to get close to the people that he will eventually stab in the back. Maybe literally. And then you have Leonardo DiCaprio's Ernest, a young, naive man who becomes Hale's latest tool to manipulate into achieving his goals. But Ernest is not innocent in this. He's cowardly and openly admits his love for money, and despite everything he goes through and the people he loses along the way, he never, even by the end, learns his lesson. That's why this works. Killers of the Flower Moon never feels like a PSA telling you that racism is bad. Its entire thesis is conveyed through subtext. It's the things that aren't said that reveal its true message. It's a little nihilistic in some ways with its depiction of how people never seem to change, but it does write home the idea that every action has its consequences and that they will catch up to you sooner or later. This is the movie that introduced us to what we these days associate with the word zombie, which is something that can't go understated, but at the same time, it's very bare bones and doesn't do an awful lot of interesting things with its premise. Considering its low budget, I think Romero's use of black and white cinematography is genuinely captivating and adds a lot of weight to certain sequences. The direction of the film and imagery used really elevates the surface level elements into something truly memorable. However, a lot of the film's post-production choices result in a movie that not only hasn't aged very well, but lacks the impact it needs in certain moments. The obvious elements for me were the editing and sound design falling very flat when the stakes should be at their peak. As the ghouls are clawing their way through the window and Ben is hammering them away with whatever he can find, the impacts are practically silent, which makes it difficult to truly appreciate the severity of their circumstances. That being said, the climax of the film still hits as hard as it did back in 1968. The absolute hopelessness of the ending makes for a super bleak and upsetting note to end on. The credits roll over a bunch of still photos, which serves the purpose of giving you enough time to process what just happened and to marinate in the uncomfortable aftermath of it. This is a film that I respect a lot in its artistry and its influence on the medium as a whole, but as a standalone film, far more interesting things have been done with the formula, even by Romero himself. I don't love Night of the Living Dead, but I do like it. And that's what I watched this month. I didn't really get around to seeing as much as I'd have liked, but I tend to feel that way after every month. Time just moves too fast. But let me know what you watched this month. What do you think about the movies I saw? Pop them down in the comments, and I'll be sure to check them out when I can. In the meantime, be sure to follow me over on Letterboxd, link in the description, to keep up with what I'm watching. But for now, thank you very much for sticking around, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.